Hey everybody, Krista Horn, your mining coach, and I'm very excited because this week we have Irvinne Simataa. I have known him for a couple of years. He's joining us on this week's podcast, and it is going to be an awesome day because we're going to talk about all things technology. We're going to also talk about some of our learnings as we have, a very diverse leadership team coming through the ranks over the last couple of probably 2 decades already. And Irvin has been breaking some new ground in that area as well. And he's going to share with us today his story, lots of learnings. Irvin, good morning or afternoon. We've just crossed over to the afternoon. Welcome. And how are you this afternoon?
No, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Christo, and good afternoon to your podcast listeners. Yes. I'm certainly great and excited to have the conversation.
Fantastic. Irvin, I'm not going to introduce you. You're going to do that. But I would love our listeners just to get to know Irvinne Simataa a little bit better. We are global, so there's a lot of people from other countries and other continents listening. Who's Irvinne Simataa? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your career up to this point.
All right, so maybe just a brief introduction of myself, Christo. Irvinne Simataa is a mining executive in Namibia. I read for my mining engineering degree at WITS, and since then have doubled into management with the University of Stellenbosch and University of Pretoria. I've been in the industry for about 20 years. I've had the privilege and opportunity to lead, manage multidisciplinary teams within De Beers, Anglo-American, Anglo-Gold Ashanti, Vedanta, and of course have had some experience offshore with Kenme Resources in Mozambique. And I'm currently the Executive Vice President for Swakop Uranium, the world's second largest uranium open pit mine in the world. Yeah. So that's me.
That's not all of you. Yeah, that's very impressive. But yeah, just digging a little bit back into the history, you come from, call it, and I guess a lot of our South African and African-based executives have come through breaking new ground as the first leaders to be a Black GM and leading mines. That must have been quite a journey. And tell us a little bit about, how that experience was for you. And what do we need to know? How can we help a younger Irvin going through the same thing? Because despite the fact that we want to say, it's a long time since independence, it's a long time since a democratic country has been, being able to elect their own leaders, there's still a lot of legacy issues, and we can talk as we want, but there's a lot of, previously disadvantaged and Black leaders out there that are still actually breaking through. We look at our board levels, you on a number of boards yourself. We've served on boards together as directors. Yes. If you look at the boards today, there's still a lot of inequality in those areas. Without talking politics, these are just realities. We must face it. Would you mind sharing a bit of, advice and guidance, and how was this journey for you, being one of the first to become a Black GM?
Yeah, so thanks, Christo. I think it's a conversation that I must highlight. One, obviously, dreads to talk about, but at the same time, I think in hindsight, I do recognize that my journey was a little bit unique, because not only was it a question of, sort of the previously disadvantaged individuals assuming leadership, in an industry which I think all of us can agree has predominantly been on the more previously advantaged end. Yes. But for me, it was also a question of millennial leadership. You must understand that when I came into the role of general management, I was only 31. So I had to deal with the fact that you a transformational leader from a background perspective, but also there's the aspect of now sort of experience, so to say. Now, what I can say, Christo, first and foremost to your listeners, is that I think it's important to understand that being first is not a destination. That's one thing that I definitely realized from my perspective. I think, there's many things that I've done in my life where, you can claim to be the first, but the one thing that I've definitely learned is that it's not a destination. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second point I'd like to make is that, of course, coming into that role, I quickly realized that I had expectations that I had to manage. Of course, being Black and being young, there are expectations from quotas that associate with that privilege, if I may say so. So that was the one angle to it. But also, I did recognize at the time that there were some quotas that obviously this aspect would be a new aspect, because until then the industry was obviously, as you would know, predominantly white dominated, and not just white, but male white dominated.
Yes.
Until that point. So,
Yes.
I mean, it was an aspect that I had to quickly, sort of come to terms with it. So the challenge that I had, Christo, from my point of view, was that in managing these expectations, I had to center myself from a point of view or a departure point that at the end of the day, I was, entrusted with a responsibility, and that responsibility was to produce results. And therefore, in managing the expectations from both ends, in terms of, sort of the younger workforce, the Black workforce, government officials, expecting that you would do things in a certain way because of your background.
Yeah.
And of course, then managing the fears of, the predominantly privileged employees or stakeholders or, sort of partners that we had in terms of what it would entail. I had to center myself and remember that at the end of the day, it was about the delivery of business results. What I can say, Christo, is that I spent a lot of time educating people about what my real mandate is, what my thinking is, and also helping them appreciate that in as much as I appreciate the expectations, there has to be reasonability in terms of the expectations of privilege and the fears of the change. And ultimately, I think the one thing that I did very well was to bring everyone on board in terms of what my expectations were based on the mandate that I had been given. Of course, I must say this was not without flack. I think you and I worked in the southern geography of Namibia. You would understand very well that the unions saw my appointment as a win because in their minds, they had fought for this transformation for a long time. And therefore, that win needed to translate into, a certain change as they saw it. But of course, I had to educate in terms of what change means and how change has to be encompassing and a win-win for everyone.
Yeah.
So I went through that journey, and I must say it was a very difficult journey. It was a very, very difficult journey because you had to get, beyond the hurdle of educating to mitigate those expectations, which some were reasonable, but some quite genuinely were unreasonable. And then you had to manage the fears of those that had not seen that kind of change. But I think ultimately, having brought everyone on board, and I did this through being very clear on my vision for the business. Being very clear on my vision for the business, being very clear on my contribution to the country, and also being very clear on who I was as a person. And also being very clear on what I had done to get where I got to. Because remember, there was a lot of self-sacrifice, which had nothing to do with my background, had nothing to do with the color of my skin, but everything to do with the choices that I made in my life. And I think through that education, we came to a point where all the stakeholders got to understand that at the end of the day, we've got a job to do, and that job must happen for all of us to thrive. And I'm glad to say that I think when I look back at my time, from my appointment up until now, I think people judge me predominantly on my character. They judge me on my content. They judge me on my results. Of course, good and bad, because we've had to do difficult things along the way. But I think what's important is that they have moved beyond judging me as, the first. And I can, finally, I think, transform that heavy burden into something meaningful for those that are coming behind me.
Sure. And some of the listeners,
it's also worth highlighting. Sure. It's also worth highlighting, Christo, that those kind of events should not be taken for granted. because there's many of us who get those opportunities and we make them individualistic. So the one, sort of learning that I took from there is that given that I was given that privilege and recognized from that perspective, I actually used the platform to then advance similarly disadvantaged individuals or groups, such as women, women in engineering or women in mining, et cetera, et cetera. So that, I think from that perspective, I can put hand on heart and say I used that opportunity, either from a recognition perspective or from a fear of change perspective, to actually transform other minorities that I felt needed representation in various sectors.
Fantastic. And just for our listeners, you may even have already stopped listening just because we seem to have a political conversation, and we're not. We're having a human conversation. We're having a conversation about, the mining coach is all about the diversity across the spectrum, from an operator level that wants to be the best operator to the EVP that wants to do exceptionally well leading a mine or a business. And there are a lot of cultures and languages and skin colors at different mines across the world. And if we don't have these conversations about how difficult it is, and Irvin sharing his stories about, I had to manage expectations. If we don't have those conversations, how are we going to advance? How are we going to get better at this? And I was challenged, and Irvin, just for our listeners, because it was a little bit of a curveball this morning, because we had a script that we had before the time. And just this morning for our listeners, I said to Irvin, I left him a voice note. I said, are you comfortable to talk about this? We didn't talk about it before the time. And I must tell you, I want to just give acknowledgement to my daughter, because we had a very good conversation last night. And she was asking me about the diversity of our audience and the guests that are on the show. And I was saying to her, I definitely am targeting everybody across the spectrum, because we want to include everybody. And then she said, so what are the type of questions that you're asking? And I explained it and said, you're not scratching deep enough. You're not exposing the real issues here. And these issues need to come, to the surface, so that a younger Irvin and a younger Christo that is from a minority group can take advice, can learn. Anything else? I mean, Irvin, that stands out for you? Was there one or two key moments where it would really, really tough, and you had to push through and say, I know what I want, and I know what I want to achieve out of this?
Yeah, no, look, I think, there was a point, obviously, in my professional life where I had to make decisions that, unfortunately, would, on the naked eye, look as if I'm a proponent of a labor system that had been abolished, which obviously is highly political.
Yeah.
I'm particularly referring here, Christo, to when we made the decision to outsource mining at Scorpion Zinc, where I was general manager. Now, the reason I mention this is that at that particular point in time, if one is not careful, and you listen to the general sentiment, which obviously has got a historical basis, particularly around the labor system, then we would lose the reasonability of the conversation. And I had a very difficult time trying to convince unions, employees, government officials as to the business reason as to why we had to do that. Because the easier conversation was around why it was not desirable because of the historical context of the country. Yeah. And that was the easier conversation. The difficult conversation was to understand why we actually had to do it as a business for us to survive. Now, it took, a professional toll on me, because, over the years and up until now, there are obviously people that still believe that, I do champion outsourcing, the use of contractors in mines, etc., etc. So my job at the moment is to continue to educate as to why business would make decisions in that particular direction. So I think that was a very difficult one for me. But I'm also glad to say that at the end of that decision, the majority of the stakeholders and individuals got to understand why we had to do it, and they were very grateful that we took, you know, a 1 year life of mine to a 5 year life of mine. That translates into 5 years of salaries, 5 years of supporting 12,000 or more people, 5 years of opportunities of education, 5 years of opportunities to take kids to school, and 5 years of preparation for the next opportunities. So, so the conversation became, you know, fairly easier. But I think it's one item that I would like to point out to say, look, you know, that was difficult, particularly in the mining industry. Like I said, you had to manage expectation. You are stereotyped as a transformational individual, but the decisions that you are making are contrary to to that. So that took quite a bit of out of me. But I think, you know, I sit here today and I continue to tell the former union members, former employees who have come back to me and actually thanked me for you know, for how we professionally handled it and the effort put in to explain. And I'm glad that actually I still think that was the right decision, because it took the business forward, and we provided livelihoods for as long as we could.
Well, thank you for being vulnerable and just sharing, you know, sensitive topic, which we need to talk about. It's no use we ignore these things. And then in our script before the time, we spoke about what do we want to talk about today, and you chose technology and sort of the future of work in that area and how all of this plays out. Why did you choose that?
So I particularly chose the topic of technology because in the first instance, I'm trying to, you know, exercise the millennial leadership aspect of the transformation that happened in the past with my appointment. So I think, Christoph, from my perspective, I recognize that the times that I got appointed, or the times that I was birthed into the industry, is prime for people of my caliber that do not have the historical legacy of when we, but we have a historical legacy of the now. And I think, you know, for me, I view technology in many of the businesses that I've worked in, I view technology as a lever that is rather underestimated. And it's underestimated purely because of, from a leadership vantage point, what we know is what we stick to and what is comfortable. However, in the case of Nokia, in the case of Kodak, examples are many that if mining businesses do not transform, you know, it's obvious what the direction is going to be. So I chose actually this particular topic to highlight to mining leaders out there, particularly leadership, as to why it's important to actually be technology leaders, because that is the future of work, and that's how businesses are going to survive and thrive and be sustainable into the future.
And you're very right saying that, you know, it's a, if you don't, you know, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It is very difficult to do these things. And why do you think particularly is the mining culture and the mining industry so difficult in adopting and moving quickly on this front?
I think in answering that question, Christo, first, I must highlight the premise on which we as mining leaders should be convinced that technology is the way to go. Firstly, I think all of us can accept that in the last decade, we have seen an enormous increase in input costs within the industry. You can talk about diesel, you talk about electricity, you talk about water, you talk about consumables like sulfur, etc., etc. There's been an enormous increase in terms of cost, and that has eroded most of our bottom lines. Most of our business are marginal because of this increase in cost. That's the first point. The second point is that there is clearly pressure from legislation, regulations, and the global cohort of, you know, governments and NGOs in and around, you know, making sure that the industry itself actually doubles into clean energy. So at the moment, I mean, all of us, the world over, and in fact, most countries, South Africa and Namibia, we've signed up to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is very clear in terms of reduction of emissions, particularly when it comes to fossil fuels. In our mining case, predominantly diesel, because that's what we use. So there is pressure, and I get the sense that it's just a matter of time before African governments follow the route of Europe, where they have now started putting or tightening the belt on polluters. And therefore, we will see legislation changing, particularly emission regulation changing, which obviously will become a financial risk for the mining business. That is the second point. The third point is that there is definitely a social expectation as big corporate citizens, the way we interact with the communities, our host communities, or the countries that we operate in, the expectation is that there is a reduction of waste that interacts with those particular communities. So I think, you can clearly see from that perspective, Christo, that the question around whether or not we must adopt technology is one that we definitely must endeavor to unpack. And my view is that that is reason enough to adopt technology. Now, the challenge as to why the mining businesses are either lacking or slow in adopting technology, I would say is threefold. The first one is leadership. And leadership has to do with board and management. Given the three areas that I've highlighted, cost, regulation, and the social expectations, the boards and management that have a fiduciary duty not only of the triple bottom line, but quadruple bottom line, which is the sustainability leg, they have to be in a position to give policy direction for the companies that relate to technology. And that technology, of course, must address those three areas that I've highlighted. Now, most of us, we've obviously worked for several companies, and those companies that we've worked for, we have noted that there are companies that have the strength from a policy direction at the board level, and therefore filtering to management and then the individual entities that they run. And if I'm allowed to mention here, I would mention Anglo American. I think all of us know the net zero policy of Anglo American, which has been put into practice in various forms. So that is the first point I'd like to make. So mining leadership has to accept and has to demonstrate at the highest levels that there is a requirement to move the technology way. And that is at the board and management level and filters through the organization. That's the first point. So I think if we strengthen that perspective, then we should see adoption move quite fast. The second point, Christo, has to do, and here you must hear me out, because this is something that actually I've been studying and researching for quite some time. I think one of the biggest challenges why mining companies do not have a cohesive response in terms of technology adoption is the question of opportunity cost. Mining companies have not found a formula where in adopting technology, we do not increase the cost of ownership at the expense of business viability. So what then tends to happen is that we just say hydrogen is expensive, and therefore we don't go that route. Solar, we can manage, and therefore we go that route. But my view is that at the end of the day, you do not have a technology roadmap that is cohesive and that makes a dent in terms of the overall objective within the business. So my advice there, Christo, is that businesses, once they've been given the mandate by the board, should spend some time to understand how they can move beyond what I would say, discrete, disjointed projects to a technology map where they are very clear in terms of, how the opportunity cost of transforming the organization from a technology perspective actually works. And they might just realize that some technologies actually are for the business, and other technologies, yes, you might have to take a bit of sacrifice, but it's for the better good of the social aspect of how we operate. So that is the second point. And the last point that I would like to make is that even those companies that have boards that drive technology and perhaps have the skills and the knowledge of how to determine what technologies are appropriate and will be good for the business and hence the opportunity cost, the implementation aspects are a challenge because, and I would like to give you an example. When we do, efficiencies, production efficiency projects or, sort of in-house projects, we generally tend to think that the people that know best are the skills that exist within the business. But you remember that skills is closed to what they know. In fact, they drive in the direction of what. So my advice there would be to say, to adopt technology successfully, we must find the right subject matter experts that can collaborate with the internal skills and therefore make sure that our execution strategies are successful. That is the third point that I was gonna make. So basically, execution is lacking because of what I've highlighted. Number two is the opportunity cost prevents us from making technology decisions. And then, of course, at the end of the day, if the board and the management who are supposed to provide direction and oversight don't drive technology, then we have a problem in the industry.
Sure. You've clearly thought about this a lot. and I think an obvious one that people, especially if a mine has a lot of people working at that mine and they hear about technology, hear about, Twitter, that's, there's people losing jobs, Facebook, people are losing jobs, all of this. How do we deal with the fear of, well, technology is going to take my job security away and I'm going to be ending up losing my job?
I think our first point of departure, Christo, is to make our employees understand the benefits. And I particularly would sum up the benefits for the sake of this conversation into two. One is increasing our ability to utilize the products and services that we already have. That's what technology does, because we improve on what we have through technology. And the job gets easier, it gets better, it gets faster. The second one is value creation. Now, value creation is where my interest actually is, because technology creates value for business in many forms. Number one, safety. Back in the day, a typical geologist or surveyor would walk around with a GPS. We don't need to do that anymore. There's drone technology, etc., etc. We take the person away from the face of the risk or from the coal face, and we deploy a machine and utilize the individual to do the complex analysis of the information that technology gathers. So that is one. So I think there's a huge advantage in that. The second one is productivity and efficiency. So mundane and repetitive tasks no longer has to be done by millions of clerks, millions of workers pushing paperwork. There are automation machines, etc., that they can do that. That leaves the human being now with the complex and creative tasks of doing work. So that is a huge advantage. The third one is the aspect of cost. We can definitely, from my perspective, we've been able to expand and scale operations using technology, whereas if we had not used technology, it would mean you duplicate, you increase mass, and that is just huge cost. So for businesses, definitely, the benefit is that the aspect of cost is actually covered. Now, what I want you to highlight with what I'm saying now is that I keep on saying that using technology leaves the human employee to the complex tasks of creativity and decision making. Now, what it effectively does, Christo, people that worry about technology, sort of impacting the jobs in the market, the first thing that they should think about is that I think technology is an opportunity for human beings or human employees in the workplace to evolve their skills. What it will do is that there's actually an opportunity for employees to improve from current skills to the skills of the future.
Yes.
That is the first opportunity. Yes. And the second opportunity is that given that mundane and repetitive tasks are now done by machines, etc., it allows the human employee to make the best decisions, because now they will now focus on the complexity and creativity. So that is the second one. The third one is that, yes, job losses will not be avoided. However, what I would also like to highlight to you is that technology is an opportunity to actually create new industry.
Yes.
What you should know, Christo, is that typically in the mining industry, we've always been used to doing paperwork. Everything was on paper back in the day. Mine plans, you print, you draw, etc., etc. But at the moment, software development is a new industry in mining, and it's huge. And it's huge. So my view actually is to say the job losses which can happen are actually equally compensated by new opportunities, new job opportunities within the within the mining industry. So I would actually say that for colleagues in the industry, what is important right now is to recognize that going into the future, it's going to be a question of machine and human collaboration. And we have got a responsibility to upskill ourselves to be ready for that kind of future.
Yeah.
Because those that will be finding themselves, of course, out of work are those that would still be having skills, current skills, which the only change would be they would be irrelevant in the future. And therefore, the opportunity is to actually upskill at the moment and be relevant for the future.
And that's exactly the type of people that are listening to this podcast. They want to become the best version of themselves. They want to grow their careers. They're ambitious. They're looking for opportunities to learn. And that's why they're in this podcast. That's why they are listening right now. And you've just opened that door about, okay, so I may be in maintenance and I've done this. I'm a foreman now for the last 5 years, but I really like the software. And, you know, in my free time, I'm doing programming. And what I'm hearing you say is, this is the opportunity. This is the time to create a new skill for yourself that you will be the first in line, you know, when that technology comes, to raise a hand and say, here's the opportunity. Anything else that, you know, would you like to motivate people listening to this podcast now, and maybe our viewers on YouTube? You know, is this something that they should embrace to make a career change? Why not move over from mechanical engineering to data science or whatever that may be? What's your view on that?
Exactly, Christo. What I would like to highlight is that the traditional method of work, which typically myself and yourself would have been used to, where a mining engineer is a mining engineer, that thought and thinking is dead. The reality is, at the moment, a mining engineer could be a techno-economist, meaning he's got the technical skills, he can go on to do a financial qualification and actually work in financial modeling. Yes. The accountant who works in finance can become a techno-economist by doing a technical qualification and do financial modeling. That is just the fact. Somebody in IT could become a mining software guru purely by adding on a technical qualification. So my view actually is that to be competitive in future, for somebody that is in the mining industry at the moment, they definitely should consider, as I said, upskilling themselves, moving from the traditional thought of being a geologist, a mining engineer, and being ready for the future of work. And the future of work, quite frankly, Christo, you know, a mining engineer would be one that we would expect he should be able to function as a technical specialist, but also as a financial specialist, because at the end of the day, you want this person to be a business person, not just a technical person making technical decisions. So I would definitely suggest that, you know, colleagues and the young ones, as they come up through their graduate training programs, they already start thinking about, you know, what future do I want for myself? Do I go into business analysis? Do I go into software? Do I go into general management, etc., etc.? It's definitely required. So I think at the moment, actually, it's the right time to make a career change in mining. I know that a lot of people have gone into banking, technical specialists going into banking, and the other way around as well, you know, financial specialists going into technical. But I think the time is rife, given, you know, and the good thing is that I think companies the world over have also recognized that fact, is that your best production cost accountant is probably a mining engineer who has the technical understanding of machines. And your best your best designers are mechanical engineers who have gone and done, you know, machine learning, etc., and some finance. So I definitely would support, you know, the notion that it's probably time to make career changes at this particular point in time.
And thanks for that, because, you know, one of our previous guests on the show, Cornel Verster, he was also, you know, he also chose the technology subject, and we spoke about, he's an electronic engineer, and, you know, he's a lot into the software side of things. And he said all of the skills that he's got at the moment, he's taught himself, you know, on free platforms. You know, there's a lot on Google that you can just go, and there's free education out there. So we're not just talking about that, the graduates out there. We're talking about any person, even at operator level, at, you know, at supervisory level, that don't have that first, you know, that tertiary qualification. What you are saying, what I'm hearing you saying, there's an opportunity for you. Prepare yourself and just develop, learn new skills.
Exactly. That's exactly it. We, Christo, in my previous life, what I've always driven is exactly what you've highlighted. I've had metallurgists that have gone into procurement and done very well and actually loved it. because they could then bring that understanding into the procurement space, as you highlighted. So for sure, I mean, at the operator level, in fact, those conversations continue to happen. You would know in the industry that there is this question of multi-skilling and financial reward expectations. And in fact, I had these conversations recently, just a week ago, where I was talking to artisans and mining operators and telling them to say, when you are an electrician and you are an electrician in a particular workshop, you as an individual cannot restrict yourself to a particular machine, because the future of work would be one individual working on multiple machines. So to be able to be ready for that future, you can have exposure, because in a mine setup, we do have several workshops with like shovels, trucks, etc., etc. That opportunity exists where you can do that. You can do self-learning. You can study if you want to improve that kind of skills. But of course, the conversation was brought about because when I did initially have the conversation, there was a question from the individuals to say, but you see, the company expects us to do more than what we're employed for at zero reward or recognition. And my argument was, that's where the problem starts, is that your expectations are purely centered around remuneration, but you are not recognizing the fact that the future, that remuneration will be based on the skills that you have. And the skills that you have right now will be relevant at that particular point in time. So I would suggest you work on the skills and be ready for that relevance when the time comes.
Yeah. And the people listening to this podcast, they are the ones that realize, look, I cannot expect the company to always be the one that educates me. There's a responsibility on my shoulders to go out and prepare myself and grow my own career. This is up to me as well. I've got a decision, and I can't expect the company to do that. And these are the type of people that are listening to this and are inspired by exactly what you are now saying to them to do.
Exactly.
Any technology failures or successes that you've been quite vulnerable today, but that you are willing to share? And what was the learnings from that, or the recipes to success from those success stories on the technology front?
I think I'll start with the success, because usually that's easier. So definitely the one success that I can highlight, was our geotechnical technology program that we implemented that allowed us to, stretch mining activities for at least 2 years under very difficult circumstances. We had 400 lives that we had to look after through technology. That is just a fact. So we mined, after the first failure that we had in one of these open pits that I managed, we managed to work that open pit for at least 2 years, purely through the assistance of technology. And we managed to get buy-in from the employees as well. And we were very transparent, and they understood how those technological systems could assist us to put them, not necessarily in the line of danger, but in a very risky area, but be confident that when something does happen, we will be able to, first and foremost, see it up front and then make the right decisions. So that was one of the successes that I can say, that investment was actually worth it. I think a failure that I can point out was to streamline HR systems, around attendance, time and attendance. I think everyone in the industry knows that at the moment, most companies, it's very rare that you'll find companies where, your attendance affects payroll activity directly. Attendance is typically separate, and then payroll is separate. And we were attempting to basically bring the two together. So when you clock in biometrically or whatever, then, the payroll system will register and it will basically do a timesheet. And the remuneration is based on that actual timesheet, which is basically linked to your biometrics. So we attempted that. And unfortunately, I think we failed to implement it. And the reason why we failed to implement it is that we had not anticipated the quantum of interfaces that we had to look at. We were just looking at the pure technology standalone. We had not appreciated all the other nuances around, leave, the different types of leaves and, what if a person clocks and the biometric hasn't worked? There was a lot of things, and we had to go back to the drawing board, and we actually decided to say, look, I think this technology project, we probably had not sat down and thought about it thoroughly, and therefore let's close it before we create social upheaval and, of course, financial drain, because it's not going anywhere. So that was one of my failures. But of course, at the moment where I work at the moment, we are busy implementing a similar system, and that experience from my failure is actually something that I'm pouring into the business, so for purposes of learning, so we don't make the same mistake.
Failing forward.
Yeah, that's it. That's
learning.
It. Look,
learning
I've always said, I think there's a cliche that says adversity introduces a man to himself. It's not so much, the question of the quantum of the failure, it's how you handle the failure. So from my perspective, I've only succeeded because I've failed more than the next person. They see the successes, but I've failed much more. And that's why I said, even the question of being first, I take the responsibility, but I'm also very cognizant that it's not a destination.
Yeah.
It's just the beginning of work. And you have a responsibility to do unto others the same that was done to you. So, yeah.
A journey of discovery and learning.
That's it.
Have you got any advice for supervisors, leaders of people that are right now faced with implementing new technology and helping their teams navigate this difficult transition?
Yeah. So the first point I think I would say there, Christo, is that the question of enrolling people into the vision is very critical, because people have got to understand, or employees have got to understand, why, what, and how. Because if they don't, then the question of buy-in becomes very difficult. So those leaders and supervisors who are currently implementing or executing or looking into opportunities for technology have got to realize that enrolling people into that vision is very critical. That's the first thing. The second point is how you structure yourself for delivery. My view has always been that, as I said, there are subject matter experts. Typically, these would sit outside the business, but there are also knowledgeable and experienced people within the business. It is to find the right mix and structure, that technology rollout plan, such that it's not only a question of buying, but it's also relevance. Because remember, most of these technologies, when they are when they are put onto the market, they target a particular sector, but they can be replicated in other sectors. So to bring that experience, you need people internal to make it relevant for our business, but you need the subject matter experts who know the behind this, the black box, to be able to fast track that adoption. So that is the second point. The third point is that, as I've highlighted, I think I would suggest that companies have PMO offices, project management offices, because this is not business as usual. Most projects fail because they are considered as business as usual. To have a PMO office is better, because then that PMO office usually will be accountable through the right channels to the overall manager of the business, whether general manager, and I would actually suggest the general manager, because then you've got sight and criticality from that perspective. But a PMO office is relevant because then you have accountability.
Yes.
Because when you are implementing and there's no accountability and there's no oversight right from the top, it becomes business as usual. And failures and successes will all look the same. And eventually, the interest and relevance actually wins off. And that's why most projects, 3-4 years from now, you'll say, but we wanted to, but we never did. And nobody knows how it was closed out. So that is the third point I was going to make. And then the fourth one, I think the culture of the organization, Crystal, is very important. I remember, and I must speak on your example, when you did the RP 2.0, and I wasn't obviously in your business. I was a competitor next door, but of course our business is very, very good standing in the southern part of but we were very clear, even on the outside of the business, as to what your journey was going to be. So you can imagine if we had clarity on the outside, that, clearly on the inside, similarly, that clarity definitely must have been there. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that technology, just like any other project in a business, like you are doing an expansion project or whatever, it actually does require that clarity. Because if it's not clear, like I said, you want to do a solar plant. Why are you doing a solar plant? For what? What exactly are you trying to mitigate? Is it a question of cost? Is it a question of emission reduction? Is it a question of sustainability? What is it? So if we have that clarity, then I think from my perspective, the organization itself, the organizational culture will come into its own. I genuinely think that most people like to say their organizations are learning organizations, they're high performance organizations, etc., etc. But the challenge is, how do you speak that into what you do? How do you speak that? So my view is that for us to succeed, we have to embed technology as part and parcel of the company culture. I personally like to think that companies like Microsoft, companies like Google, companies like Facebook, they allow their employees to think of themselves as technology architects, and therefore their ideas keep flowing, and the companies continue to grow and thrive. And I think there is no reason why mining companies cannot think like that.
Sure.
Because then it allows because remember, where are the ideas going to come from? The ideas are going to come from the shop floor.
Yes.
If an employee feels unsafe, or they feel like they are not productive, or they feel like the expenditure is unreasonable, naturally they'll start thinking about solutions.
Yeah.
And that solution engineering process is where this technology filtration does come through. So I genuinely think if you've got the right culture in the organization, those solutions predominantly will be technology solutions, and that's how you embed it. So us as leaders, in as much as we say our organizations are high performance organizations, they're learning organizations, we need to deliberately drive that culture of technology, and we should be fine.
And we should be fine. Thanks a lot, Irvin. I realize our time has just flown past. It's been a very immersive conversation today. I would like, maybe if you can just close off for us today, what would you tell a younger Irvin, looking at yourself 20 years ago, you've started out, is there anything you would have done differently? Or tell a younger version of yourself, focus on these three things. This will, make it a lot easier for you.
Yeah. So I think maybe the first point, Christo, is that I would definitely advise myself to have made a lot more mistakes in my earlier years of my career. Reason being is that as I grew into the industry, I realized that I became risk averse based on my perception of risk, which was obviously based on my experience in my earlier years. Where I am now, I think I'm in a comfortable position now, but I should have been in that comfortable position much earlier had I made the mistakes I needed to make earlier on in my career. And when I say mistakes, I'm not particularly saying, I should have been, how do I put it? I should have been doing things I shouldn't be doing. What I'm saying is that I should have immersed myself, allowed myself to be criticized, allowed myself to learn, do the time, which I think I did, but I could have done more. Certainly ground myself technically, leadership wise, and make those mistakes. Because at that point in time, quite frankly, you are allowed to make the mistakes, and most of the time those mistakes would not be financially significant. The challenge is that if you wait to make the mistakes at these levels, typically those mistakes are very significant. So that's the first thing that I would have advised myself to do. And then the second one, I think the point that you just highlighted is that I genuinely think that diversifying my skills is one aspect that I probably delayed in my career. To the point that you made, I think coming out of graduate programs, I should have probably paid attention not just to the mining stream. I should have earlier on paid attention to the finance, because at the end of the day, mining is a business. I should have paid attention to procurement. At the end of the day, it's about logistics and parts. I should have paid attention to safety leadership, because at the end of the day, we work with people who have got families, etc. Of course, that I've course corrected along the way. But I'm just saying, for those that have the opportunity now, start earlier on.
Yeah.
The third one, Christo, is, I think the current generation has an opportunity to learn from the mistakes that you and I have made. And one mistake that definitely I would want the current generation, younger generation, to learn from us is that, when we started out, the mining industry is one that I think looked after us very well, but we did not look after ourselves from a point of financial management, health, and building a brand as an individual. I think, some of us in our earlier years, we might have missed that opportunity because we were stuck in this bubble of being in an industry that looks after you. I would suggest that they don't make the same mistake. There's opportunity there to be financially savvy as an individual, to look after your health, and balance work and life, and certainly learn more earlier on. When you are at these levels, time is an expensive commodity. And unfortunately, you have to make sacrifices. What else? And then I think, look, actually the last one, and this one I keep on saying it, is that when I was mentioning the fact that being the first is not a destination, the point I was trying to make there, Christo, is that how you handle that responsibility will determine how far you go. Because had I let the voices that sought to convince me that because you have been given this throne of a king by us, and therefore you owe it to us to do things in a particular way, then I don't think I would have gone as far as I had gone. My view is that for those that come through, and women leadership, it's not only about Black leadership, but it's women leadership, etc., etc. Really, what they need to think about is when they should take that responsibility seriously, and they need to sort of see themselves into the future, irrespective of whatever decisions they want to make at that particular point in time. And I'm glad that that situation sort of never changed what I believed in. It never sort of got to my integrity. I stand here today proud that I've made decisions that others might think were a little bit tough, were wayward or whatever, but I can still stand today and say I was correct in making those decisions.
You own your decisions.
Yes, I've owned my decisions, basically. Yeah, that's it.
Irvin, thank you so much. It's been a really good conversation, and I know that you're a busy person. You've actually just given us this hour, and I really appreciate that. We want to release you so that you can go and keep on adding value and making a difference there where you are the leader of that operation and that company. Thank you for your time today. And to our listeners, thank you for listening. And to those that are looking at this on YouTube, thank you for watching. Irvin, a few final words from you before we finish off.
No, thank you very much, Christoph, for the opportunity. I hope that your listeners, young and old, find one or two things that they can take away from this. And I really wish you all the best. I think you've got the right platform, and we are here to share the knowledge. As you highlighted, this particular topic is one that's relevant for the current workforce. And I think we should never look at technology as sort of a detractor. There are disadvantages, but I think at the end of the day, once we know what the potential advantages are, we as individuals can work on ourselves and feed into that stream, which in any event will happen. It's just a question of when.
Yeah.
But thank you very much.
Thanks, Irvin. You have a wonderful day. All right, we are back, having had a fantastic conversation with Irvin, and I learned a lot today. So number one for me was that you being the first coming from a disadvantaged background, that's not easy. There are huge expectations on you as an individual from all stakeholders. And leading on to that, the second point is that you as an individual need to ground yourself in who you are and then manage those conversations and expectations very carefully, as they, in some cases, might be very opposite and different. Then I've also learned from Irvin, don't be afraid of making mistakes. The next thing he said is don't be afraid of making mistakes, especially if you are much younger, because the cost of those mistakes are not as expensive. And then finally, he spoke about just maybe if he would advise to himself a younger version, make sure you also take care of your health and the family and work-life balance. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. You can reach out to us at www.theminingcoach.com, and you'll find some resources there, and you can get into and connect with us there. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for watching. Have an awesome rest of your day. Enjoy your mining. Cheers.